I think by now we all know that the Catholic Church has had its fair share of controversies over the years, mostly tied to priests, and we definitely know what they've become infamous for. And on this list there will be a couple of cases like that, but some of those priests have also gone as far as murder, and there are other priests who've gone even further and taken part in actual genocides. Today, we'll be looking at 7 of the most evil Catholic priests. Brendan Smith's path through the Catholic Church involved a decades-long pattern of child abuse that went largely unchecked, despite repeated red flags. He belongs to the Norbertine Order, an institution traditionally devoted to spiritual care, yet over time his name became synonymous with a scandal that exposed vulnerabilities in the Church's accountability structure. Born in Belfast in the late 1920s, Smith entered religious life early, eventually becoming a priest who was trusted to work with children in parishes and institutions across Ireland. From the outside, Smith appeared to be a kindly figure who offered support to families. He delivered sermons and performed baptisms, and many parents believed he was a stable presence. However, rumours and quiet allegations surfaced periodically. Whispers circulated in the background about uncomfortable encounters and breaches of trust. No official investigation took hold at first, partly due to a culture of deference to clergy, and partly because those who suspected wrongdoing felt unsure about challenging someone in a religious authority. Smith's pattern of abuse spanned multiple countries. Over the years, he moved between parishes, often reassigned under murky circumstances. In certain cases, church officials received complaints but opted for internal solutions, such as transferring him rather than reporting him to the civil authorities. This cycle continued, enabling him to access new communities where he could commit further crimes. Frustration grew among some rank-and-file church members who sensed that leadership wasn't taking decisive action. By the early 1990s, changing attitudes towards clerical wrongdoings and an increased willingness to address abuse brought Smith's actions into a harsher spotlight. Individual survivors, once children in his care, began to speak out publicly. Media outlets picked up these stories, detailing how he exploited his role to coerce and manipulate the very individuals he was supposed to be guiding. That public exposure led to legal steps which, for the first time, cornered Smith into answering for his actions. In 1994, Irish authorities arrested him on charges linked to multiple instances of sexual assault. The details were harrowing. Children abused in what should have been safe spaces, sometimes extending periods. Evidence presented during legal proceedings outlined how Smith used fear and secrecy to trap his victims in silence. Families expressed both heartbreak and anger, feeling deceived by a religious institution they trusted. Many who followed the unfolding news felt that this case was symptomatic of a broader systemic failure. Smith's trial saw testimony from individuals who carried the weight of trauma for years, unsure if they would ever see justice. Their accounts provided vivid depictions of an individual who orchestrated a disturbing double life, sanctimonious in public, predatory in private. The court found him guilty, leading to convictions that reflected the scale of his offences. He served prison time, but further charges and investigations emerged, extending into the mid-90s. Smith died in prison in 1997, cutting short some legal processes that were still active. He left behind not only an array of criminal convictions, but also a legacy of anguish among survivors and their families. They spent years grappling with questions about how many people within the church hierarchy knew of his actions, and why no one took stronger steps to halt this pattern of abuse. Journalists and investigators continue to examine archived letters, parish records, and personal testimonies to pinpoint the extent of this institutional failure. Federico Cunha arrived on Madeira Island carrying an aura of priestly respect. On the surface, he appeared to be another devoted cleric entrusted by the Catholic Church to maintain spiritual order in a small, tight-knit community. Yet behind the outward show of devotion, there was turmoil brewing that few locals could have imagined. Cunha's role extended beyond leading daily masses. He had an uncanny knack for integrating himself with families and finding his way into circles of young people, typically under the guise of guiding them in faith. Tragedy struck in 1992 when the body of 15-year-old Luis Correa was discovered at a location not far from where Cunha was known to frequent. At first, rumours were sparse, and fingers didn't point directly at the parish priest. People struggled to link a spiritual figure to anything remotely violent or predatory. However, police inquiries soon unveiled unsettling details that placed Cunha in the orbit of the teenage victim around the time the boy disappeared. Investigators scrutinized his movements, cross-examined his statements, and tracked down any clue that hinted at how a supposed man of God had ended up implicated in such a dreadful incident. Through painstaking detective work and multiple witness accounts, a picture of deception and cruelty came into focus. It turned out that Kuna wasn't just standing nearby when the tragedy occurred. He was identified as the prime suspect. The sheer idea of a priest's involvement in a teenager's death rattled the community to its core, creating turmoil in a place that had always taken pride in its strong religious heritage. Parishioners who once welcomed him with open arms now stood at the church's doorstep, wondering how they had been blindsided so completely. When charges were formally brought against Kuna, Madeira's residents and the broader Portuguese public became locked in a cycle of shock, anger, and grief. Prosecutors presented evidence indicating that Kuna had deeper, more troubling inclinations than anyone had suspected. It wasn't just one act of violence, it also involved allegations of manipulative behavior, potentially sinister intentions toward minors, and hidden actions that stood in direct contradiction to the values he was supposed to uphold. Courtrooms filled with distressed families and anxious spectators who wanted to see proof for themselves. The outcry in local media further stoked the sense of betrayal. In 1993, Kuna was convicted of murdering the teenage boy, receiving a prison sentence that could have kept him locked away for life. Yet, any thought that this verdict would close the chapter on his crimes proved to be wishful thinking. Kuna managed to secure temporary prison leave, a privilege sometimes granted for good behavior, and used the opportunity to flee the country altogether. Instead of returning to his cell, he vanished, leaving authorities and the victim's family reeling. His escape ignited a manhunt that underscored how determined Kuna was to elude accountability. Law enforcement teams scrambled for leads, attempting to track him across international borders. The trail finally went cold in Brazil, a country that didn't make it easy to extradite an individual under these circumstances. Despite Portugal's efforts to bring Kuna back to serve his sentence, he continues to evade justice to this day. This absence of formal conclusion to the case left many questions hanging in the air. How could a convicted murderer slip so easily through other channels? Who might have offered him help, internationally or otherwise? For the Catholic Church, this scandal spurred international investigations and intense self-reflection. Critics argued that the church leaders failed to respond decisively when faced with clear red flags about Kuna's behavior. Some local parishioners wanted public acknowledgement of what they viewed as a moral and administrative breakdown, while others tried to remain neutral, believing any rush to condemn an entire institution based on one priest's crime was unfair. On Madeira, the lasting aftermath was more than just a headline. Residents still trying to make sense of how a friendly face at Sunday Mass could harbour such darkness found themselves grappling with fear, anger, and a painful sense of confusion. In the years that followed, authorities kept the case alive in a legal sense, though in practical terms, Kuna still remains out of reach, leading a surprisingly comfortable life in a rather well-off area of Rio de Janeiro. What's more baffling is that he is apparently still a practicing Catholic, even still attending Mass on Sundays. This is despite the fact that he committed what the church would view as an unforgivable sin, and appears to have completely gotten away with it. Gerald Robinson's story unravels in Toledo, Ohio, where he served as a Catholic priest for many years. In 1980, a horrific event shook Mercy Hospital, a place usually associated with care and recovery. Sister Margaret Ann Paul was found strangled and stabbed inside the chapel on Holy Saturday, a day before Easter Sunday. At the time, the gruesome nature of the crime stunned hospital staff, clergy, and local residents alike. Investigators were quick to examine the scene, taking note of potential ritualistic elements in how the body was arranged, but they struggled to piece together a clear motive. Suspicion flared around various individuals, including those employed by or frequently present at the hospital. Robinson was among those initially questioned, yet despite certain inconsistencies in his statements, authorities lacked the kind of conclusive evidence that would stand up in court. The case became a cold file. Friends, family members, and even police personnel wondered if Sister Margaret Ann's killer would ever be identified. Meanwhile, Robinson continued performing ritual duties, officiating Mass, hearing confessions, and going about the day-to-day routine expected of a priest. Parishioners who recognized his name seldom connected it to anything sinister, believing that if there had been evidence to charge him, it would have surfaced back in 1980. Years turned into decades, and it seemed the murder would remain unsolved. That changed in 2003, when the local police department revisited the case with fresh eyes. Advances in forensic science led investigators to track down old witnesses, recheck records, and scrutinized physical traces from the crime scene. The more they dug, the more certain patterns emerged that cast Robinson in a suspicious light. Discrepancies in alibis, contradictory interviews, and the possibility of a personal dispute with Sister Margaret Ann started to form a coherent picture. Rumors circulated about a conflict between the priest and the nun, though specifics often varied depending on who was telling the tale. In 2004, authorities arrested Robinson, charging him with the murder that had haunted Toledo for nearly a quarter century. This development came as a huge shock to the locals. The community had grown used to the idea that Sister Margaret Ann's death was an unsolved tragedy. Now they faced headlines suggesting that a trusted priest was not only implicated, but likely responsible. Reports of how she was found, stabbed numerous times, with wounds forming a pattern that some saw as ritualistic, gained renewed attention. Legal experts debated whether the evidence truly pointed to a ritual killing, or if it was simply a grisly homicide made to look symbolic. Robinson's trial took place in 2006, drawing local and national media coverage. Prosecutors presented physical and circumstantial evidence linking him to the scene. Witnesses spoke of tensions between Robinson and Sister Margaret Ann, and forensic specialists described marks on her body that seemed to match a letter opener associated with the priest. The defense, meanwhile, portrayed Robinson as a convenient scapegoat in a decades-old case that lacked definitive proof. They questioned whether police had grafted threads simply to close a high-profile investigation. In the end, the jury found Robinson guilty of murder. The conviction put to rest a chapter of uncertainty that had spanned more than 2 decades. Sentenced to a lengthy prison term, he maintained his innocence, insisting that he had been wrongfully accused and convicted. Yet, the evidence, both physical and testimonial, proved persuasive enough for a guilty verdict. Opinion in the community was split. Some believed the verdict revealed the true nature of a man they trusted for years. Others felt the conviction was born of shaky circumstantial arguments gleaned from reinterpreted evidence. Robinson's imprisonment and eventual death in custody in 2014 brought a quiet end to the legal saga, but the crime's impact lingered. Many parishioners still couldn't believe that the priest they'd known, a figure who offered guidance in confessionals and performing weddings and baptisms, was also the man found guilty of killing a nun. Hans Schmidt emerged from Germany with a seemingly devout calling. He journeyed to the United States in the early 20th century, where he served as a Catholic priest. At first, he blended into parish life, offering sermons that some found inspiring and comforting. But beneath his religious garments was a personality that would ultimately stain not only his name, but the church itself. Schmidt's story revolves around shocking violence, hidden secrets, and a trial that shook the public. He gained a position at St. Boniface Church in New York City, a role that granted him moral authority and respect. Locals assumed they could look to him in times of great personal struggle. People in the pews saw a man dedicated to his faith, leading mass, hearing confessions, and offering guidance to parishioners who seemed eager to follow his teachings. Yet beyond the church walls, he indulged in behaviors far removed from anything resembling a vow of celibacy. Around 1913, scandal found its way to the surface when authorities discovered the dismembered remains of a young woman named Anna Amula. Investigators learned that Schmidt had secretly married Anna despite his priestly vows, and when she became pregnant, he realized his double life was under threat. Rather than facing the consequences of his actions, Schmidt orchestrated a gruesome plan to murder her. In a horrifying sequence of events, he killed her and then attempted to discard the evidence by dismembering her body and dumping it in the Hudson River. The atrocity alarmed law enforcement, and soon enough, the trail led straight to the man who was supposed to embody spiritual virtue. Newspapers ran front-page stories on the sensational nature of the crime, stirring outrage and disbelief. Society was not accustomed to hearing about clergy implicated in brutal homicides, let alone a priest who had gone so far as to hide a marriage and an impending child. Schmidt's outward composure in court contrasted starkly with the violent details of his actions. A swirl of legal proceedings followed, drawing crowds that packed the courtroom and lingered outside the courthouse, hoping to catch even a morsel of new information about the twisted narrative unfolding inside. His defense team tried various arguments to spare him from the most severe penalty. They questioned whether he was mentally stable, suggesting that a man willing to commit such an act must have been mentally deranged. They also contended that certain elements of the investigation might have been mishandled, but none of these strategies swayed the judge and the jury, who found themselves confronted with an unambiguous chain of evidence pointing squarely to Schmidt's guilt. The prosecution painted a stark picture of a priest who lived a duplicitous existence, carefully crafting a facade of humility while carrying on a secret relationship behind the scenes. Some members of the public struggled to reconcile the man they saw in the pulpit with the details of the case, yet the physical evidence, witness testimony, and Schmidt's own contradictory statements made it nearly impossible for a jury to see him as anything but a killer. At the conclusion of a widely publicized trial, he received the ultimate punishment, the death penalty. In early 1916, Hans Schmidt was executed in Sing Sing Prison's electric chair. His downfall made headlines across the country, not just because of the heinous nature of his crime, but because he was the first, and to date only, Catholic priest in the United States to be put to death for murder. The ripple effect of his actions also struck at the core of the local community. Congregations that once revered priests as paragons of moral virtue had to grapple with the unsettling truth that men like Schmidt could exploit that deference for their own dark ends. Just wanted to jump in here and say, if you're enjoying this video and enjoy my content in general, please consider donating to my Patreon. For as little as $2 a month, you get ad-free access to all new videos, and for $5 a month, you get them ad-free and one day before everyone else. Donating will be helping me out a lot, as it will also allow me to continue to create content on YouTube. Anyway, back to the video. Ryan Erickson was ordained at a young age, instantly impressing some who saw him as a dynamic new face for the Catholic Church. Outside the sanctuary, he adopted a friendly persona, often stopping to chat with the townsfolk in Hudson, Wisconsin. No one questioned his intentions, and for a while, that small community accepted him without a hint of skepticism. All of that changed in early February 2002, when Daniel O'Connell, a well-known funeral director, and James Ellison, who was interning under O'Connell, were found shot to death at the O'Connell family funeral home. As news of the tragic event spread, it rattled Hudson's sense of security. People speculated about possible motives. Was it a robbery gone awry? Was there a personal grudge no one knew about? In the beginning, Erickson's name never surfaced in local whispers. He was simply the priest in town, far removed from any discussion of murder. That perception shifted when investigators dug into O'Connell's recent activities. Word had it that O'Connell had confronted Erickson after stumbling upon disturbing allegations tied to the priest. The allegations had to do with questionable behavior, potentially crossing the line into the exploitation of minors. Even for those who had not heard the rumors, the speculation pointed to Erickson feeling threatened, worried that O'Connell's revelations could destroy his standing in the church. The more detectives learned about this confrontation, the more they believed it might have triggered a desperate, violent response. The mounting suspicion didn't just appear in form of rumors. Detectives uncovered patterns that linked Erickson to the crime. For one, he had a strong interest in guns, something many found unusual in a religious figure. Additionally, his personal journals, conversations, and emails pointed toward a troubled mindset. Witness testimony revealed that despite his friendly demeanor in public, he could become volatile when challenged. Several Hudson residents began to recall odd encounters, times when Erickson would show uncharacteristic flashes of anger or frustration, which contrasted starkly with his role in the parish. The investigation inched forward, gathering enough evidence that local authorities felt confident in their case. Plans were made to take legal action, but before Erickson could face formal charges, he died by suicide in December 2004. The circumstances of his death coincided with the increasing intensity of the homicide probe, leaving many unanswered questions. His passing brought the legal dispute to a standstill, preventing authorities from ever subjecting him to trial. That finality also robbed the victim's loved ones of the chance to witness a court proceeding or to see evidence laid out in a public forum. In the wake of Erickson's death, follow-up inquiries continued. Details gradually spilled out about the priest's questionable relationships and manipulative tendencies. Investigators discovered he had a pattern of exploitative behavior, stretching back further than most townspeople realized. These troubling insights created tension between those who still wanted to defend the reputation of a spiritual leader and those who felt outraged by what he was alleged to have done in secret. No single entity emerged unscathed. The Catholic Church found itself under scrutiny for what parishioners saw as inadequate oversight. The community felt betrayed not just by a local figure of authority, but by the very institution he represented. People wondered if there had been red flags that should have prompted earlier intervention. It took considerable time for Hudson to process the tragedy. The shock of discovering that a supposed moral guide might be responsible for such brutal wrongdoing lingered after news headlines moved on. Friends of the O'Connell family and Ellison's circle continued to grapple with heartache, replaying the day the funeral home turned into a crime scene. Local law enforcement officers too found themselves reflecting on how even an outwardly pious individual could hide severe misconduct for so long. As the years went by, discussions about Ryan Erickson often revolved around how a man in his position could commit acts so contradictory to his role as a spiritual mentor. Some community members never fully shook the sense of disbelief. Others acknowledged that no role, no rank, and no profession grants immunity from the potential for dark behavior. Quiet conversations still occasionally brought up the Erickson case, each person adding a recollection or anecdote about his demeanor or about an incident that seemed minor at the time, but in hindsight, took on a more sinister light. Athanasi Saromba's path to infamy began in Rwanda, where he served as a Catholic priest during one of the most harrowing chapters of the late 20th century. Parishioners initially regarded him as a figure of spiritual guidance, a man tasked officiating Mass, administering sacraments, and offering solace to families coping with the hardships that had taken over their lives. In a small community grappling with political and ethnic tensions, Saromba's presence carried a veneer of calm, at least for a time. The year 1994 brought unimaginable turmoil to Rwanda. Violence erupted on an enormous scale, leading to acts that would later be recognized globally as a genocide. Thousands sought sanctuary in churches, hoping their faith, along with the moral authority of religious leaders, might protect them. Among the areas where people gathered was Nyange Parish, where Saromba had a role of leadership. Many Tutsi civilians huddled in that church, believing no harm would come to them in a sacred place. Yet, according to testimony and subsequent legal findings, Saromba played a direct role in orchestrating their downfall. The allegations painted a horrifying picture. Instead of providing refuge, he colluded with local officials and militia to trap Tutsi families seeking shelter. Witnesses recounted how Saromba stood by or gave approval as bulldozers destroyed the very church that had once been seen as a place of safety. Within those collapsing walls, an untold number of people, men, women, and children, lost their lives. Survivors described the screams and sudden chaos when it became clear that the building was being flattened with them inside. When reports of these events surfaced, they seemed almost too extreme to be believed. Accusations against clergy often shook people, but it was particularly jarring to hear that a priest had allegedly assisted in carrying out mass violence. In the aftermath, an avalanche of witness accounts and documentation laid the foundation for legal proceedings that would track Saromba across borders. He fled Rwanda after the genocide, traveling under various identities and eventually settling elsewhere in Africa, then Europe. His time on the run might have allowed him a degree of anonymity, but international efforts to hold key perpetrators accountable had already begun. Investigators gathered testimonies, compiled evidence, and built a case strong enough to initiate legal charges. In 2001, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda indicted Saromba, settling in motion a process that forced him to leave his hiding place. During trial proceedings, witnesses gave gripping accounts of Saromba's actions. Prosecutors laid out details of how he had lured individuals into believing they would find protection at Nyange Parish, before cooperating with local leaders to destroy the building. They highlighted his alleged coordination with the bulldozer drivers, some of whom testified under oath. Defense teams argued over the extent of Saromba's control and whether he had been coerced, yet the consistent threat in the prosecution's narrative was that a priest of the Catholic Church not only failed to intervene, but actively participated in mass violence against the very people who had trusted him. Ultimately, the tribunal found Saromba guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity. Judges determined that his actions were instrumental in the slaughter of numerous Tutsi civilians inside the church walls. His sentencing initially involved lengthy prison terms, and after appeals, a heavier punishment was imposed. Over time, international courts revisited and refined the case, but the crux of it never wavered. Saromba's betrayal of his spiritual responsibilities was immense, and the legal system delivered a decisive verdict: life in prison without parole. Word of his conviction reverberated far beyond Rwanda's borders. Many Catholics simply couldn't believe that a Catholic priest was involved in genocide. Rwanda itself continued to cope with the collective trauma from the events of 1994, and Saromba's case became one of several that spotlighted how even houses of worship hadn't escaped the violence that gripped the nation. Years have passed since the genocide, but the specifics around Saromba's crimes still evoke disbelief and grief in those who lived through that dark period. Families who lost loved ones in Nyange Parish spoke of the betrayal at the hands of someone they thought would be their advocate. Investigative journals and human rights activists who documented the atrocities remain haunted by the testimonies detailing how one priest's cooperation led to so many deaths. Joseph Tiso was an ordained Catholic priest who wound up leading Slovakia as a collaborator with Nazi Germany. His role extended far beyond the pulpit, casting a dark shadow over the region during World War II. Unlike many clergymen who devoted themselves solely to church duties, Tiso stepped into the world of politics and national leadership, letting his power converge with one of the most brutal regimes in modern history. Born in what is now Slovakia, Tiso rose through the ranks of religious life, yet as the political landscape shifted in the late 1930s, he took on a prominent position in the newly formed Slovak state, an entity closely allied with Hitler's Germany. In March 1939, with the looming threat of Nazi control over Central Europe, Tiso accepted the role of President of the Slovak Republic. Though he kept his clerical title, his policies and alliances revealed a willingness to adopt the rhetoric and practices of fascist ideology. Under Tiso's leadership, Slovakia enacted a series of measures discriminating against Jewish citizens. These laws chipped away at the civil and human rights of the Jewish population, paving the way for deportations that would lead many to detention camps. Local communities that once saw Tiso as an upstanding clergyman found themselves grappling with an unsettling reality. On the one hand, he maintained his priestly garb and performed religious services for the faithful. On the other, he presided over a government that aligned itself with Nazi Germany's vision of racial hierarchy. The ongoing conflict in Europe allowed Tiso to justify his increasingly harsh policies, claiming national interest took precedence. Personal pleas from Jewish families, along with protests from some church figures, went largely ignored. The severity of these actions increased as the war escalated. Tiso's administration collaborated with German authorities, facilitating the roundup of Jewish citizens. Many were sent to forced labor sites or straight to extermination camps. Historians still debate the level of Tiso's direct involvement in every step of the deportation process, but there is little doubt he approved government decrees that laid the groundwork for these atrocities. Telegrams and official correspondences bear traces of his knowledge and consent, underscoring his influential hand in shaping anti-Jewish strategy. While Tiso's name might not ring as loudly as some of the more notorious figures of World War II, his blend of clerical standing and political authority set him apart. Even amidst the chaos, he continued delivering sermons, often infusing them with nationalist themes that left little room for empathy toward those labeled as enemies of the state. In effect, he weaponized his religious platform to defend discriminatory policies, intertwining Catholic symbols with extreme nationalism. Towards the end of the war, as Nazi Germany's defeat appeared imminent, the moral and political cracks in Tiso's regime grew more apparent. His government lost the grip of its territory, and by 1945, Soviet troops and anti-fascist partisans had effectively swept away the remains of the Slovak state. Tiso fled, but he was soon captured, leading to his post-war trial in the newly re-established Czechoslovakia. Throughout the proceedings, Tiso presented himself as a clergyman who had assumed political power out of necessity rather than desire. His defense argued he had no choice but to collaborate with Germany, and insisted his involvement in the deportations was indirect. Nonetheless, the evidence laid out by prosecutors painted a damning picture. The court concluded that Tiso was complicit in enabling Nazi efforts against the Jewish community, ultimately approving the policies that led thousands to their deaths. He was found guilty of treason and collaboration. The verdict culminated in a death sentence, and Joseph Tiso was hanged in 1947, still wearing his priestly cassock, an unsettling fusion of spiritual attire and the harsh reality of his political downfall. Photographs of his final moments, wearing the same garments that once symbolized guidance and compassion, drove home how deeply he had betrayed his calling. And that's the end of the video, folks. I do hope you found it interesting and somewhat entertaining. Be sure to like the video, leave a comment if you're new, subscribe, and consider donating on Patreon, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.